Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session on interviewing skills, interviewing etiquette and skills. Actually, now is fine. Thank you, Debbie. I apologize for the delay. I was actually catching up with some old friends, so this has been a real treat for me. At this symposium, I have seen many fellows that I've worked with before, graduate students I've worked with before, as well as some colleagues, some of whom I worked with when they were on the graduate student or postdoc side, who are now successful and in new careers. So I hope that you're enjoying today's workshops, seminars, panels, and I strongly encourage you to stick around for the networking session at the end of the day. That will be a fantastic chance for you to start to interact with the speakers. If you have not done so already, some of you may have done some great networking over lunch, but I do hope that you stick around and introduce yourselves, collect business cards, and keep in touch with contacts in fields of interest, because that kind of networking is what will lead to, eventually, an interview, hopefully. So do stick around for that. Thank you for joining me here today. My name is Melanie Cinch, and I serve as a career counselor and consultant to the Office of Intramural Training and Education here at the NIH. I am actually based in Connecticut, so I work part-time, serving the trainees across all levels and offering workshops on career development topics. And so, just to give you a little bit of my background, I've been a career counselor at universities for about 12 years now, and I've worked primarily with the graduate student and postdoc levels. So it is a pleasure to speak with you today. This is actually one of my favorite topics, interviewing skills, because there are so many crazy stories about interviewing. I don't know if any of you have your own, any good stories, bad stories about interviews that you've had, things that you thought went very well, things that you thought did not go as well. But in preparing for the workshop, I pulled some sample interview stories. These are real scenarios that were collected when a survey was conducted by Harris Interactive of 3,100 HR managers, so human resource managers across all industries. And so I wanted to share some real stories, real anecdotes of real people who were in interview settings. And I apologize because the font is tiny. I wanted to give you the top 10, so I'll read them. The candidate answered the cell phone and asked the interviewer to leave her own office because it was a private conversation. Okay, these things really happened. The candidate told the interviewer he would not be able to stay with the job long because he thought he might get an inheritance if his uncle died and his uncle wasn't looking too good. Okay. The candidate asked the interviewer for a ride home after the interview. You know, that sometimes is offered by the interviewer, but I don't know if I would ask for a ride. The candidate smelled his armpits on the way to the interview room. Okay, so again, body language, very important. You don't want to be doing any of this, you know, or checking yourself really before or during the interview. If you're in the building, you want to watch out. Okay. The candidate said she could not provide a writing sample because all of her writing had been for the CIA and it was classified. All of her writing ever in her whole life, I guess. The candidate told the interviewer he was fired for beating up his last boss. Okay. A little bit later in the session, I'll tell you a real story about a practice interview I did with a student, and it was not far from that, so it was pretty bad. When the applicant was offered food before the interview, he declined, saying he didn't want to line his stomach with grease before going out drinking. And, you know, believe it or not, when I was working with undergraduates at the University of North Carolina, I was called by an employer from New York City who said that the student showed up late for a morning interview and was hungover and said that he was hungover from drinking the night before. So very poor, very poor. I would not encourage that. A candidate for an accounting position said she was a people person, not a numbers person. I also, not a good match. The candidate flushed the toilet while talking to an interviewer during a phone interview. So while you might think you can get away with that with family and friends when you're on the phone, and even that's a stretch, I would say definitely not for phone interviews. And finally, a candidate took out a brush and brushed her hair. So I just wanted to share those to say these things really happen. I am sure that none of you would engage in this kind of behavior during an interview, but I wanted to share that just because things happen. Things happen. In terms of when you first enter an interviewing situation, if you are meeting with a recruiter for the first time, meeting with a senior scientist, talking with someone actually today when you're networking with people, first impressions matter, the first 5 minutes matter. In terms of dressing professionally, this is actually on the same survey that we just talked about with those top 10 interview gaffes. Those same human resources managers were interviewed and asked what the biggest mistakes are that people make. And there were two. The first one was that candidates dress unprofessionally. And so what does that mean? I've had many questions around dress and what's appropriate, and when candidates understand, when students or postdocs understand that the culture at a particular workplace is pretty casual, they ask questions about, well, you know, I know that they all dress down for work and wear jeans and wear sneakers, so I should, you know, probably wear that to the interview. The guideline that I would use in that particular situation is, or in every interview situation, is to try to dress maybe 1 or 2 levels above the dress code at that workplace. So I worked for a startup in Cambridge many years ago, and they had a very casual environment, very casual culture. And I arrived in a suit, like this, a pantsuit every day, until finally my boss talked to me about it. And she said, you don't have to wear a suit here because we all wear khakis and jeans. And so I took it even beyond the interview. But I think you are safe with a suit. What the, or you know, really any professional looking top, skirt for women, I think what the recruiters and the HR managers were talking about in that survey were really inappropriate dress. So sneakers and jeans, yes, but then we've seen some changes in the workplace with torn clothing, or with, particularly with women, with inappropriate lengths of skirts or tops, and that really creates a negative impression. Because what you're trying to convey to the employers is that you're serious about the job that they have to offer. And you can convey that through the way you dress. What about nonverbals? What does that mean? Nonverbals convey messages. What are some nonverbals that you can think of when you first meet people, when you're talking with people? What are some nonverbals? Eye contact, definitely. Fidgeting, yes, when you fidget. What might fidgeting indicate? Or nervousness? And that's okay, because that happens, right? In some cultures, it is considered inappropriate to look people, in particular people who are in positions of authority, to look people directly in the eye. But if you are interviewing for positions in the US, it is important for you to try to maintain eye contact. You won't maintain eye contact the whole time. You may be looking at your notes, you may be taking notes while the employer's talking, but it is important for you to engage, because in US culture, it's really important to recognize the other person through eye contact and acknowledge them. So that's very important. Using your hands, I think there's a limit. I've seen myself on tape, and I probably use my hands too much to gesture, but that's another one. And that can convey excitement. So nonverbals, you know, the messages that they convey are not all negative. They can be positive too. Smile. I had a long time ago, had a colleague who was interviewing for a position at Disney World as one of the characters. And she was interviewing for Snow White. And so it wasn't a character with a big costume. They would be able to see her face. And she actually did look like Snow White. But during the interview, I talked to the recruiters actually afterwards, this is several years afterwards when I worked in a career center. I spoke with Disney, and they said they actually measure the number of times you smile during the interview. So they count the number of times you smile. Because when you're a Disney character, you have to smile all the time, I guess. So smiling is very important. Again, conveys lots of messages, but really primarily interest in the job, interest in the organization. And then finally, introduction and handshake. When you first approach someone, someone will probably stand up from behind a desk, or they may meet you in a lab, or you may attend a panel interview with lots of interviewers. And so to give you some practice now, I would like to ask you if you could stand and introduce yourself to two people. So just name and the institute that you work in with a handshake. And I'd like for you to do that now. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, here's a question for you. Is there a right and wrong way to shake hands? Yes. Okay. What is the wrong way? Limp. I saw that gesture right away. Limp. Yes. Yes. To have a limp handshake really conveys maybe a lack of interest, maybe a lack of strength. And so it's important for you to be firm in your handshake. What else could you do wrong in a handshake? Could shake someone's hand too long. In fact, the last time we did this exercise when I was here in September for preparing for a job fair, where there are a lot of handshakes, there were some people who had very, very, very long handshakes, and I was asked, what's the appropriate number of shakes? And I had no idea what to say, because I don't know what the appropriate number is. I know what I do. It's usually maybe one or two, while I'm looking at the person in the eye and introducing myself. Okay? What else?
Both are trying to speak at the same time.
I'm sorry?
Both are trying to speak at the same time.
Both people. Oh, okay. Both people are trying to speak at the same time. Okay, and what might you do in that case? Or what might you do to prevent that? Watch the person's eyes, and yep, nonverbal cues. Absolutely, absolutely. So that can be awkward. So you just might want to give yourself a minute or pause and have the person introduce him or herself. Anything else that we can do wrong with handshakes?
Too hard.
Too hard. Yes. It was actually at that same job I had in Cambridge when I met with the vice president. It was a startup, so it was pretty small, and I met with everyone. And he just crushed my hand when I met him. And it was kind of tough to recover from that. But that's what you want to look out for. So you want to be firm without, really hurting someone. And you want to stay away from really limp handshakes. And you want to maintain eye contact. And not shake for too long. I've never really heard of anyone shaking for too short a time, but standing there for a long time with someone, that can get awkward. So in terms of the types of questions that you might hear during an interview, there are several different kinds. I would be prepared to talk about everything on your CV or resume. Some people have been surprised by questions that go way back in their educational background or work history. I taught English in Ukraine for a while in '93, and when I was interviewing for a job in '98, I was asked about it, and it wasn't really related to the job, but they wanted to know that I had interacted with other cultures in the past, and I was surprised, but it appeared on my resume, so I needed to be ready to talk about it. So if anything appears there, you need to be ready to talk. I would also be honest on those documents, because if you embellish the truth in any way, that can be picked apart during an interview, and that can also get very awkward. And it's very easy for employers to find out the truth about past courses that you've taken, or degrees that you hold, or GPA levels, or employers, or PIs. So being honest is really important. Otherwise, there are two big types of questions that we'll talk about today, and we'll talk about them in more detail. Two different kinds of questions. Standard questions and answers. What are some typical interviewing questions that you have heard yourselves in interviews or that you've heard about? Yes.
Tell me about yourself.
Tell me about yourself.
It encompasses so much, and it's the hardest question to answer. I mean, where do you start? Personally, academically? I mean, it's really, I find it one of the most difficult questions to answer. Tell me about yourself.
I have heard that many times from many students and postdocs about that particular question. Tell me about yourself is one of the most difficult for people because they don't know where to start. They don't know whether the employer is interested in their personal life or their hobbies or what they did last week or, you know, where they ate dinner last night or their work. So one tip that I offer for people who are preparing for interviews is when you think of any question, and in your handouts you have lists and lists and lists of potential questions that employers might ask you, behind every question the employer really wants to know, what can you do for me? So if you share information about, you know, well, I like to play tennis, or I'm a great cook, or, you know, personal information, or I enjoy, you know, knitting, that's interesting, and that may come up later once you're in the workplace, but in terms of their question, tell me about yourself, I would just remember that behind each question, I would encourage you to try to answer or try to reframe as, what can you do for the employer? So if it's tell me about yourself, then it could be tell me about your current research, tell me about your program at your university, tell me about why you're interested in this organization, things like that. Or why you think you're a good fit for this position. And how many of you have heard of behavioral-based questions? Okay. That is a very popular style of interviewing, and we will talk about it in detail later on today. What about questions about the job or the employer? So the employer, regardless of the type of work that you're seeking, if you're looking at science policy, science writing, if you're looking to do some freelance writing and you're picking up a project from someone, they may ask you about your understanding of the job. You know, well, do you understand what I'm asking you to do, and will you be able to deliver this manuscript on time? Knowledge of the field and current trends. If you are looking to work in a nonprofit that works on international health, do you understand what are the current trends? What's going on? For you to demonstrate a background knowledge to the employer is critical. Organizational knowledge, knowledge of the employer, of the particular employer, that can be done really easily these days on the web. Most employers have really comprehensive, easy to read websites about their history, about their future, where they'd like to go next, and so that's, you know, fairly easy. In terms of your interest in the job, though, that's where I would spend some time. You know, I would really spend as much time as you can in trying to understand the position that you're applying for and how it fits into the overall organization. To express a sincere interest and enthusiasm in the job and the organization will make a big difference, will make a huge difference. So how can we prepare? How many of you are looking at academic positions down the road, applying for faculty jobs? Okay. So some ways that you can prepare through researching the institution are trying to understand the research interests of the other faculty in the department. The people who have been successful, I think, some of the people who have been successful in securing faculty positions have been able to make a case for themselves and their work filling a need in a department. So filling a gap. After studying the rest of the faculty's research areas, if you come to understand, oh, okay, they really do need someone who's working on this area, and you can demonstrate that and articulate that in an interview, I think that's powerful. Understanding the student population, obviously, is critical. There have been sessions today, I think already, about working at predominantly undergraduate institutions. You may apply for a job at a tribal college. You may apply for a job at an inner city community college or a large research university in the Northwest. Wherever you apply, you need to come to understand the student population, and I don't mean memorize their demographics, but have a sense of, generally, of where the students are coming from and what they look like. Courses offered, again, this is where you could shine during an interview if you study the curriculum of a particular department, study the course requirements for majors. You may see through your research that there, again, is a gap that you could fill personally. And maybe there's a course that you could design that would be attractive to that department. And so the more information you can share with people, and potentially strike up some collaborations. So if you do understand the research interests of the faculty, you may even propose during an interview that there are several people, and actually in a cover letter, even before the interview, that there are several people that you might like to interact with and work with. And I would name them by name in a letter or during the interview. Or, if you're applying for a particular organization, what kinds of services do they provide? If it's a government agency, if you are looking at regulatory affairs, what do they work on? What do they provide? What is the outlook for that particular industry? And by industry here, I mean sector of the workforce. I don't mean working in industry, private industry, in research. Is there opportunity for growth in the industry, in the sector in general, or in that organization that you're applying to? What is their history? We talked a little bit about that. And so the better prepared you are, the more successful you will be in an interview situation. So that sounds like common sense, but it really is important. Now, in terms of preparing to talk about yourself, there are many, many different areas that you can cover, and we will practice a few and write a few today. In terms of the first bullet point, your dissertation work or your research, your current research, whatever you're working on now, I'd like to ask you again, if you would indulge me, and stand up and share with your neighbor, anyone sitting near you, just very briefly what you're studying right now, the research that you're conducting right now, as briefly as you can, and then we'll move on. Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. You can wrap up your explanations. Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for your participation. I would now like to ask you, how did your partners, neighbors, colleagues, friends, how did they do when they responded to that question? Were you able to understand what they're working on? Yes. Good, good. I gave you about 2 minutes total, so that was about a minute each. That is excellent. That's terrific. So the more you can practice talking about your work and be able to share it with people who may not be in your field, be able to explain it in layman's terms, that's very, very helpful and will help you think through it and come to a point where you're sharing information and sharing, what your ultimate goal is and what you're working towards, with your lab or on a team. Can you see, in an interview situation, can you see any mistakes that someone might make when asked about their dissertation or their current research?
Jargon.
Natalia?
Being specific.
Being too...
Great details about the method or things that they do. It's not really interesting.
Being too specific, going into great details about the methods in that. It may be that your interviewers don't have the knowledge, so they're not following what you're sharing anyway. Or they may just have liked a broad overview of what you're working on. And someone else had something over here?
Same thing, jargon.
What's that?
The same thing, jargon.
Oh, jargon? Absolutely. Yes, here in front in the green jacket.
I'm making copies.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
I'm making more copies.
Not knowing when to stop. That is critical. Thank you very much, Debbie. That's a pretty frequent, I would say, interviewing mistake. Not one that would necessarily kill your chances, but you need to watch your response time. So you need to watch for nonverbal cues from the interviewer. If the interviewer is tapping a pen or sighing or, looking around, looking at a watch, you want to try to speed it up, wrap up your response. That is common. So people need to work on response time. Needs to be appropriate, not too short, not too long. I had conducted a practice interview with a man once who was looking for a job in marketing. And I asked him to tell me about himself. And he said, well, I have great communication skills. And because we're in a practice situation, and some employers will do this, they'll give you a hand, they'll draw it out of you, but I asked him, can you tell me more about that? And he said, well, I talk to my friends. And I just said, okay, we need to turn off the tape because you need to work on that response. So, really you need to practice that response length, but also practice the content and come up with really persuasive content for your responses. So if you are looking for, think you will apply for faculty positions down the road, gaining teaching experience is critical. You all know that it's a tough job market right now for faculty positions, but it's not impossible to find them. And so the people who are being hired, and I actually talked to one of the speakers for today, who's at a predominantly undergrad institution, about a time when she was on a hiring committee, and she said, we would really just set aside the CVs that did not have any teaching experience, and those would go into one pile, and then we would start working on the pile of people who had experience. So standing in a classroom and delivering a lecture is critical. And you can find those experiences. It's not easy. You may have to fit it in, not necessarily during work time, but maybe after work. But it is really important for you to find those opportunities to teach. That will strengthen your application and make you a much more attractive candidate. In terms of your future research plans, be ready to talk about those. Again, this definitely depends on the type of position you're applying for. So be ready, think through it. With some job applications, you will have had to write a research plan about your future plans, so you should be prepared to talk about it. And in terms of skills and characteristics, there are some skills that really are attractive to all employers in all sectors and all industries across the globe. But some in particular will be more significant in the jobs that you're applying for. So, for example, if you want to find a freelance writing job, you need to be able to write. So that's, that's a pretty straightforward one. If you want to conduct research, strong research skills. If you would like to be a teacher, demonstrating presentation skills is important. So what I'd like for you to do now is to take out the worksheet that you received. It's just the one-page worksheet that's called Interviewing Worksheet. And just in the first, it's actually not in the stapled handout, but it's separate.
A lot of people don't have it.
Okay. Let's see. Is Debbie here? Yeah, thank you for checking. There's a one-page handout called Interviewing Worksheet that has lines on it that says skills on the left-hand side. Oh, it is in the stapled one. Okay, thank you for that. I think when Debbie prepared the extras, she put them all together. So thank you for that, and if you open up to that worksheet, I'd like to give you a minute to fill out. I'm sorry? Some of you don't have a stapled pamphlet. Okay. Let's see. If someone can grab one of the reps from the OITE table, that would be great. They're making more copies now? Okay. Actually, if you have a blank piece of paper, you can still do this exercise. If you think about, so you just take, any paper that you have, notebook paper is fine. If you think about skills that you currently possess, so I named some of them: presentation, writing, communication, if you actually have it, research skills, teamwork skills, whatever, strong skills you have. If you list a skill that you have on your piece of paper, and then underneath that, or next to it if you have the worksheet, I'd like for you to write a specific anecdote of a time when you've used that skill. So an anecdote that you could share with an employer that demonstrates a time when you've used that skill. So I'll give you a minute to write that. But the more detailed you can be with your story about when you've used that skill, the better. Thank you.
Making copies as fast as we can. Okay. Still have more copies coming off the press. I still have more copies. I have more copies coming off. As soon as they come, I'll be glad to.
Okay. On the worksheet, for those of you who don't have it, there are actually 5 different spaces for you to list 5 different skills. I would try to shoot for maybe 8 to 10 if you're preparing for an interview, to come up with as many skill sets as you possess, along with anecdotes or stories that support that skill. Because you can use this information to respond to a lot of different types of interview questions. So, for instance, if I were to ask some volunteers in the audience, Tell me about yourself. Can someone respond with a skill and then a story that backs up that skill? Yes?
To think aloud. To think aloud, that means talking while you are thinking. Speak out what you are thinking immediately.
Okay. So to think aloud, so to brainstorm and to come up with ideas immediately.
Yes.
Okay. And when have you demonstrated that skill?
It's my first time to present my data in my journal club,
Mm-hmm.
and the first time to present a paper review in the journal club. Because I'm a new postdoc from a foreign country,
Mm-hmm.
and actually both my PI and my colleague was astonished because they thought I have a lot of teaching experience, but actually I just graduated from medical school. I'm a student, so
Great.
that helped a lot.
Okay.
That idea comes from a close friend who are a teacher.
Excellent. Okay. Well, congratulations on that. It sounds like you did a good job. The response was the ability to think aloud and share ideas, and the supporting evidence was that the first time that this postdoc attended a journal club, she was able to share data just off the cuff, or as, just standing in front of a group immediately. And so that is a skill. That is definitely a skill. What are your greatest strengths? Same thing. You can draw from the worksheet that you just went through, or the exercise that you just went through. So if I were to ask another member of you, tell me about one of your greatest strengths, what would you respond? Yes?
Well, I'm good at giving presentations, and an example I can give is when I came to do my interview at NIH and I did my presentation of the research I did before. I actually got paid an honorarium at the end because they said it was a very good presentation.
Wow, that's excellent. Your stories are so good. Congratulations on the honorarium. The response was, my presentation skills are very good. They were so good that when I came to interview at the NIH and gave a presentation, they offered me an honorarium at the end of the presentation, which is excellent. That is fantastic. Okay, what about why are you interested in this position? That you really need to have real data in front of you. You need to study the organization and the job description. However, you will find in the job description, and I would encourage you to do this, if you take the job description when you're preparing for an interview and highlight skill sets or keywords or attributes that you know you will have to have in this job, and then take your CV or your resume and put them side by side, you can start to highlight pieces, and that will help you to come up with your stories. So your answer to that may be, well, I'm interested in this position, and I am interested, I really like my job because it requires presenting. And I enjoy presenting in front of large groups, and and that kind of thing. So what you've just done could lead into a response to that question. Okay. How would your peers describe you? This one might get more into personal characteristics, personality characteristics, but I'll ask for one more volunteer in the exercise that we just did. So how would your peers, lab mates, team members describe you? And you can use a skill for this. I'm sure they would have a lot to say. Natalia?
I think I would say that they would describe me as a good collaborator,
Mm-hmm.
and that's because we worked on a project together, and we share data, we share our experiences in the project, something like that.
Okay, excellent. So how would your peers describe you? As a very good collaborator, sharing data, sharing information and ideas. Absolutely, those are all very good. And so now with that, you can also use your responses in that exercise to why should we hire you rather than another candidate. I heard from a candidate who went through this question with an employer, and he said, I don't know because I don't know the other candidates. So that's not as impressive. I would really stick to what do you have to offer and what can you bring to the job. And then tell me about yourself is a tough one, but we've already talked about it. So in terms of behavioral-based questions, this style of interviewing is very popular right now because most employers will not know you. Some will, and I hope that they do. I hope that you've made some great contacts today through your networking, but you will one day probably be interviewing with someone who doesn't know you, and employers across the board, across all industries, have moved to this style because the best predictor of your future behavior is your past behavior. And so if an employer can ask you, tell me about a time when you disagreed with your PI and how did you handle it, that will most definitely come up in a future work situation when you disagree with a boss or a supervisor about something that you're working on. And so for them to hear a story about, well, this was the situation, this is what happened, and these are the results, that will help them to understand, okay, well, if we hired, this woman, these are the steps that she'd take, and this is how she'd handle that stress on the job at work. And so really, these are the 3 steps you would take to work through behavioral-based questions. So what was the specific problem? What steps did you personally take to solve the problem? And then what were the results? So what did you accomplish? So some behavioral-based questions that you may have already heard, but that you may hear in upcoming interviews. Give an example of a time when you faced an ethical dilemma. I've met with many fellows over the years who have actually come to me with ethical dilemmas and had good ideas about how to work through them in the lab. And so those kinds of stories, those anecdotes, will be very powerful for employers to hear. Give me an example of a time when you solved a difficult problem, persuaded someone or a group to do something they opposed, took a risk and failed. So what might that demonstrate? That, a response to that question might demonstrate your resiliency, because we will all fail. We will all continue to fail on the job. But knowing how you responded to that failure and how you came back from it, that will be meaningful to an employer. And then served as a member of a team, that really is critical in most occupations, and some even more than others. So now I'd like to ask you to go through those steps spontaneously with your partner. I would like for you to now get together in pairs or turn around and talk to your neighbor and answer this question. So one of you will be an interviewer and one of you will be the interviewee. And answer this question. Give an example of a time when you solved a difficult problem. And this can go back to early on in your educational experience, or it could have happened yesterday. So I'll give you a minute to do that. right, if everyone can wrap up their conversations. Thank you, Debbie. I'm very glad to hear lively conversations. So you all apparently are very talented problem solvers. So that's great. How did your partners do? What did they do well? What's that?
They analyzed the situation well.
They analyzed the situation well. That's excellent. Okay, so they were able to provide specifics and talked about how they, what they took away from the problem and how they solved it. Natalia?
With one example, they showed that they're not only good problem solvers, but that they're also they can be part of a team. So they show many talents in one example.
Multi-talented. Okay, so not only in their example did they demonstrate that they're good problem solvers, but that they work with members of a team effectively. So that's really powerful, definitely. What else did your partners do well? Honesty. Okay, it sounded sincere and honest. Okay, so this is one of the last stories that I'll share with you today, and then we'll wrap up because I think we're just about out of time. What I mentioned earlier about the anecdote, well, I think the anecdote on the first slide was about beating up his boss. That didn't happen, but I did work with a graduate student once who was interviewing for a high-level sales position. And I asked him if he could share an example of a time when he had served in that role or if he had ever worked with customers, because it was important for him to demonstrate that skill. And he said, well, you know, over the summers when I was younger, I used to run sailboat lessons. And so there was a time when I was working with a few customers who wanted to learn how to sail, and I was working with one woman in particular, and I really lost it. And I said, okay, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And he said, well, you know, some of the things that she was doing, I would try to show her something, and then she would do it completely wrong, and I just got so frustrated. I just completely yelled at her and, you know, cursed at her, and I completely lost it. And, and so once again, I shut off the tape because we were videotaping it, and I said, you know, if you're going to move into a customer-focused, driven field, you don't want to share that story. Because that is a very bad story about your reaction to someone who frustrated you. Because of course customers and clients can be frustrating. And for you to be able to handle that, that's what you want to demonstrate. So, yeah, he didn't end up going into that field. But just in summary, I wanted to share with you a few points about wrapping up. When you come to the close of an interview, I think it's important for you to think about what your final message, what you would like your final message to be. Share any reminders with the employer about key skills that you have, why you think you would be the best person for the job, why you're excited about the job, because conveying enthusiasm is critical. Ask about what the next step will be. That is completely appropriate. It is appropriate to ask the employer, you know, what do you think your timeline will be for this search, or, you know, when can I expect to hear from you? That is, you know, appropriate not only when you're at the close of the interview, but maybe a week or two later. If you haven't heard by the date that the employer suggested he or she would get back with you, it's appropriate to send an email and ask that question. Collect a business card, contact information. That will be important for you. Thank the interviewer and send a thank you letter or an email immediately. That makes a difference. I have been told by people who have gone through interviews that it was really meaningful for them. And I've heard both paper mail, US mail, and email is fine. And I've heard really positive responses from employers about both. So employers who got back to their hotel room that night and they had received emails from some of the candidates who interviewed. That's really impressive and really a nice gesture. And then some employers have also talked about handwritten notes and how much they appreciate those. So it's up to you, but to thank the person for their time in general is critical. But the thank you note can also serve you well by serving as a reminder of what you have to bring to the job. And so I wish you the best of luck. And the final piece of advice I have for you on interviewing is be sure to take advantage of the services provided by the Office of Intramural Training and Education, because they will offer private one-on-one practice interviews. And I've been asked that question many times before about, I have an interview lined up with a real employer, and I'm just using it for practice. That is unethical. That is a waste of people's time and money. Some candidates have actually traveled using an employer's money. I do not encourage you to do that. I encourage you to take advantage of the resources right here on campus and practice, practice, practice. Practice alone with someone who can critique your work and offer suggestions for you, because that service is available to you here. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.